G'day ladies and gents, and welcome to War Thunder with Mags, and welcome aboard the Horton 229. So, I've received a couple of messages, both in my comment sections and in personal emails over the last couple of days, from people who feel like the Horton 229 is actually at a severe disadvantage at the moment when engaging aircraft like the P-80 and the F-80C. This is interesting because it's something that I've never had a huge amount of problem with. So I decided I'm going to do a fly out, and I'm going to show the entire flight from start to finish, show you how I climb out, how I gain airspeed in the Horton 229, and how I engage it in combat. And it may be different to the way some of you are flying it. Now, of course, I have shown this in the past, but it's always worth keeping a video up to date with current flight models and current meta within the game, and it's been a while since the Horton's been on channel. So, first things first. A lot of people make mistakes on exactly how jets operate in War Thunder, or how they work. Jets fly differently to props, and this can confuse a lot of pilots straight away. And since the Horton 229 is an aircraft that is one of the first jets that you'll gain access to in the game, depending on how you go down the trees, a lot of pilots will fly it incorrectly, or at least fly it in a manner that I consider to be inefficient. So, first things first, the turning capabilities on the Horton 229. The Horton is an incredibly manoeuvrable jet, possibly the most manoeuvrable jet in the game. However, I like to keep that manoeuvrability as a secondary, and rely on airspeed as a primary for engaging enemy aircraft. Now you'll notice instead of turning left off the runway and heading towards enemy forces here, I've actually turned right, and I'm now gaining airspeed crossing backwards across the runway. And you'll also notice that I'm currently not trying to climb. This is because I am just building up airspeed. Jet engines develop thrust differently to props. That is to say, their maximum thrust is reliant on the incoming airspeed of the air entering their intakes. So you need to be moving at a certain speed through the air in order to get maximum power out of your engines. When flying at any airspeed below your optimal, the fall-off rate for engine performance is drastic. At merely 50 to 100 kilometers an hour slower than your optimal speed, you can generate anywhere down from 40 to 50% less power than you will at optimal airspeed. In the case of early German jet engine designs, such as those on the Horton 229, the ME262 and the 162, your optimal airspeed is around about 550 to 600 kilometers an hour. Any speed below that and you're generating significantly less thrust than you potentially could be with those engines, and that's very important. If you want to keep the Horton fast, you must keep it above around 550 kilometers an hour at all times. Anywhere below that, and you are putting yourself at risk by generating less thrust, therefore lower acceleration, therefore leaving yourself in a situation where you can be easily intercepted. Now you will notice that I didn't begin to climb until I hit around about 700 kilometers an hour indicated airspeed, but I continued that climb through to about 400. Now this is below optimal, but I wanted to hit an altitude of about 8,000 feet before I started leveling out to regain airspeed. I consider it safe at this point because I am about as far away from the enemy as I possibly can be on this match and still be on the same map. This gives me all the time in the world to rebuild airspeed at this altitude while maintaining my altitude advantage and to increase it out to 10,000. Now there are actually two reasons why I turned away from the enemy forces to begin this climb. The first is because American aircraft or Allied aircraft, newer jet aircraft, feature more efficient engine designs. They can develop power more quickly even outside of their optimal zone, and they can reach their optimal performance zone a lot quicker than the Horton 229 can. So I needed to give myself enough distance to be able to wind the aircraft into its optimal combat configuration before getting into combat, because once you're there you won't be able to gain it back, or at least not if the enemy team is playing seriously. They will kill you before they let you get the aircraft up to full power. The second reason is actually because of one particular Allied aircraft, the F-84 Thunderjet. Now this aircraft gets an air spawn. Now it's not at a particularly high altitude, but from the second the match starts, while you're still on the runway winding up your engines, it's already at 500 kilometers an hour optimal airspeed, which is in the start of its thrust zone, and it's able to power away and actually intercept aircraft still trying to gain power flying towards the combat zone before they have a chance to get themselves wound up. So keeping distance on those planes is definitely something you've got to keep in mind. Now my first target's been selected. We've got a P-80 low. Now it was being engaged by two Horton 229s that flew in at low altitude and did not build speed or altitude before engaging in combat. Now they were easily able to outmaneuver the P-80 using the Horton's superior low speed maneuverability. However, they were unable to continue engaging the P-80. The P-80 simply flew away from them and was quite easily able to turn around and move back in using its high speed to intercept the Horton 229s. Now they're already beginning to scatter as the P-80 is maneuvering in to intercept them, but as you can see I'm having no problem catching the P-80. Now the P-80 stands hard on the elevators here and pulls away. I could potentially follow that maneuver. The Horton is at risk of breaking its wings if it pulls too many Gs at this sort of a speed. However, I could have followed that and got a kill shot. However, it would have cost me all this airspeed that I built up, and I don't particularly want to do that. So I let the P-80 go, and very carefully maneuvering the Horton to cause minimal loss of airspeed, begin to move on a second P-80 that's currently going for altitude. The 229 can actually retain quite a lot of airspeed, providing you are very careful with your control movements. And as you can see, I'm closing very rapidly on this P-80, very carefully roll the plane over, and we've got a clean kill shot, and I've lost minimal airspeed. At this point, do not turn back, continue to use the airspeed to gain altitude, very carefully bringing the plane into a turn, straighten out as we gain a little bit more altitude, and once I hit about 550 kilometers an hour, I'll begin to bank back to line up to re-engage the two P-80s that are now to my rear. Now I will use the keyboard to roll the Horton 229 up on its side in order to begin this turn. However, the actual elevation control of the aircraft will be entirely under mouse. Now the reason why I do this is keyboard commands are great for tight maneuvering, but they always give maximum control input to the aircraft at all times. Maneuvering sharply at this speed, of course, puts the Horton under risk of breaking its own wings, but also sharp maneuvers in a jet aircraft will cause massive losses in net energy, and I want to keep that energy high, so just using the mouse to complete the turn, controlling the elevation through the turn, will allow me to complete it while losing minimal airspeed and therefore minimal energy. This keeps me in my thrust zone and allows me to accelerate already out past 700 kilometers an hour while I'm still approaching enemy aircraft. And I will maintain level flight at this point. I don't need to go for higher altitude. The second P-80 has dropped down to continue its engagement, and even if it hadn't at this point, airspeed is more important than altitude. I need to be going as fast as possible to engage these two aircraft. Now at this point the P-80s are engaging Focke-Wulf 190s. Now the reason they didn't turn to try and pursue me is because they simply couldn't keep up with me. Because I maintained that airspeed, I was constantly outrunning them and able to keep a distance on them at all times. So they've turned back to try and engage closer and easier targets. At this point, we're about 2 kilometers off each one, so I have to work out who to engage first. So first target through, critical hit in the P-80, blow off its elevators and begin the turn back. Now this is the sharpest turn you'll see me do in this entire engagement, still maintaining around about 770 kilometers an hour, continuing to pursue the P-80 that is currently in a climb. It, however, is reaching its peak and beginning its dive over. This has put it very close to stall speed, and he has dropped out of his performance zone, which is allowing me to close distance rapidly. Now, because I've maintained over 600 kilometers an hour at all times, I'm actually in a position where I'm in the middle of my optimal thrust zone, and I'm already at speed. So, at this point, I actually have to apply air brakes so I don't overshoot the P-80. Now, I got just a couple of sparks in there, lean it over, and there we go, third kill shot, third P-80 out of the match. And that was the final aircraft in this battle. And you'll notice why the Horton 229 has an absolutely fearsome reputation as a low-speed maneuvering jet. I didn't actually utilize that ability at all at any time in this battle. As I've shown in past videos, and as I said at the start of the battle, I keep that maneuverability as a secondary. I almost always have better luck in the Horton 229 keeping it as fast as possible than I do trying to engage in turn fights with enemy aircraft. So the results for the match. We got first place for the team with 3 kills, Fighter Rescuer, Shadow Strike Streak X3, Final Blow, Terror of the Sky and Bulletproof, 63,070 Silver Lions, and we came in with 3,943 research points on a premium account. So all in all, not a bad result for 9 minutes work. So of course that does leave the question, what about the other allied aircraft you tend to encounter at this BR level? And this is the majority of the time people are talking about the F-80C and the F-84 Thunderjet. Now I'll talk about the Thunderjet first because I mentioned it in the video. Its airspawn means it has the highest chance of intercepting you before you manage to get your aircraft into its optimal combat configuration, up to the right airspeeds and at altitude. I find the easiest way to counter this is just to turn and climb in the opposite direction from which they're coming. As a general rule, the Thunderjets will get tied up with other aircraft that are on your team, or they'll cross through and being unable to find any aircraft to engage, they will turn back towards their own forces rather than continuing through to a point where they could be ambushed by multiple aircraft simultaneously. Once you have altitude and airspeed, Thunderjets are not overly difficult to defeat. Now, the more difficult aircraft is the F-80C. How I engage them is pretty much identical to the way that I would engage an aircraft like the P-80. However, in the F-80C's case, I'd want a little bit more altitude and I would go for a little bit more airspeed, and when I make my turnbacks, I would allow a larger distance. I generally won't turn back on an F-80C until I've passed a distance far enough away that I've dropped out of line of sight. So we're talking in excess of 7.5 kilometers. Then I'll make my turn back so that they are unable to prepare themselves for the turn that I have just made. I'm coming straight back at them at speed. While the F-80C is a faster and slightly higher accelerating aircraft than the P-80, and does make it slightly superior, as a general rule, that extra performance advantage only really comes into play when the F-80s are trying to run, and that only tends to happen when most of the Allied team has been eliminated and they're being faced with multiple aircraft. Once they're in combat, they are slightly better and have slightly higher energy retention to a P-80, but overall, I don't have too much of a difficulty dealing with them either, although I am slightly more cautious when engaging them. So anyway, ladies and gents, that's how I fly the Horten 229. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.